Hello. Um, this is in lieu of class. At least it's to give you some bit of a lecture. I'm also available if you have questions. Just email me stuff, and I'll try to be I'll be pretty prompt in a response, and I'll try to be as thorough as I can. With whatever response you might need. Um, the We're gonna quickly go through chapter 8, which was what you were supposed to read for this time. 8 is about Apollo and Artemis, and here we get both of them. They're not really treated equally. We get much more emphasis on Apollo. Homeric hymn number 27, the hymn they have to Artemis, is relatively short. It's not the shortest of the Homeric hymns. The two to Athena that we looked at early on, those are the shortest. Those are among the shortest Homeric hymns that we have. But so the hymn to Artemis is a little bit longer than those, but it's not a narrative. It's basically sort of a hymn in praise of her as a huntress. You can read about all the things, the various rituals, the Hyacinthia, the Brauronia, the ritual for Artemis or Thea that are in the book. There's a lot of stuff on ritual in this chapter, partly because it really applies for these two goddesses, because these two goddesses see transitions, and rituals are really sort of key with transitions, right? If we think of in our own life, we've got if you grew up Catholic, you have certain sacraments that get performed at key points in your life, and of course there's marriage, that a lot of people get married. That's a big ritual. Entering the army, even sort of like going to school, all of that stuff, you sort of like have to learn the ropes, and it becomes a transition, and that you're not fully the same afterwards. Homeric hymn number 3b, which is I think in the Greek it's about 400 or so lines long. The first part, Homeric hymn 3a, to Delian Apollo, which is about the birth of Apollo, is about 200 lines long. So all of Homeric hymn 3 is it's pretty substantial. I think it's the longest of the Homeric hymns. But 3b is by itself is quite substantial, and it tells the tale of how Apollo took over the area around Delphi and built his shrine there. And he was there was an attempt to thwart him by Telphusa, who was a nymph in the area who wanted to hold on to the territory. Now, this bit about Telphusa, and then about the Pytho that he has to face. First of all, the fact that we've got a goddess figure who's already ensconced in the area, and then we've got a male god coming in and taking over the business of the area, because there seems to have been a shrine at Delphi prior to the Indo-Europeans and prior to Apollo being seen as the god at that oracular shrine. So the myth to some extent reflects that actual Indo-European takeover. So there had been a goddess center there. It had been a shrine and an oracle there. Archaeologists have discovered some, cracks in the earth there, through which like maybe sulfuric or other sort of gases would come out, and those might very well cause someone, especially someone who's susceptible, to go into some sort of trance, and then that trance, whatever they say in the trance, would then be interpreted by a priest, or a priestess, who would then explain it in regular language for the people. Well, they'd sort of explain it in regular language. They'd couch it in terms that were very vague. If you think of fortune tellers, they do predict the future, basically because they're pretty good at reading what matters to you, and so they basically make an educated guess based on their reading of you, and then of course generally however things turn out, they can claim they were right. So I don't want to say the same thing for what was a religious cult center because that would seem to cheapen that. But they would take care to keep things still somewhat mysterious. So we've got in this Apollo being thwarted initially by Telphusa, who gives him incorrect information, and then his battle against the Pytho, which is this serpent. Now, the serpent, of course, is associated with a goddess. Serpents were generally associated with goddesses. There are serpents associated with Athena. There are serpents associated with other goddess figures. In ancient Crete, there was a snake priestess, a snake goddess figure who's actually holding snakes. So this snake, it's partly because snakes represent some sort of ongoing movement of life, and woman as the vessel of birth is seen as sort of the same type of thing. So that seems to be partly why snakes are associated with women. And even in the Adam and Eve story, it is to Eve that the serpent speaks. So all of that seems to be sort of an attack on goddess worship. So in this poem, we get certain features of Apollo. We see him as an archer. Of course, he has to kill the Pytho. We see him as a singer. When we first see him, he's playing on the lyre. When the muses are around, they're dancing. And then later, he sings a song to help the Cretan sailors get to Delphi, because they have to travel hundreds of miles on foot, and he has to keep their spirits up. And of course, we see him as an oracular god because he's establishing his oracle. We don't see really the other features of Apollo as a god. We don't see him as a god overseeing transition for young men. The sailors are not young men. They're fully adults. They're not. They're sailors, so they're obviously not kids. The thing on ritual and myth that's in the second part of chapter 8 is important. This is one of the more important sections in the book. And Van Gennep's scheme, his schema for looking at myths of transformation, where you're changing your status, is really important. This is, I would say, definitely learn this. But the three parts are the preliminal stage, which is the stage where you separate from your previous life in some way. And that can simply be traveling to a campsite where the ritual will take place. That's not where you normally go. Then you actually have the experience of the ritual, which is the liminal stage. You're on the threshold. And then the post-liminal is when you return to your regular life, but you've been changed by the ritual, right? So if we look at marriage, usually the day before the marriage, the couple do not generally see one another, so they're separated from one another. There might be bachelor parties, bachelorette parties that are done the night before or a couple of days before the wedding. And those are sort of again, you're with your cadre of friends, but not with the person that you're going to marry, right? So you get this last sort of, it's generally phrased as your last sense of freedom before you get tied down to marriage. The liminal thing then, of course, in the marriage would be the marriage itself. You go through the wedding ceremony, and then you're married. You're legally married. You've gone through sort of this trial, right? It's a public declaration of marriage, which is, the big deal. And then post-liminal, you're now part of life with a spouse, as opposed to before, when you were somewhat independent. Even if you were living together, you could dissolve that relationship a lot easier than you can in marriage. Now, I do want to mention one name here that's not mentioned in the book, and that's Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell made a career of doing comparative mythology. That's what he was a myth literature professor at Sarah Lawrence College in New York State, and He was there for like 40 years or something like that as a professor. And he, early in his career, in the late 40s, he wrote a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, or The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And his point is that that all of the hero stories are basically follow the same pattern, which he called the monomyth. So the single myth that sort of like all the myths, all the heroic myths at least could tie into. And that works as follows. The hero receives a call and leaves. That's first point. So that's like the separation. The hero has his adventure. Okay, that's the liminal part. Third, the hero returns, but the hero is now different. And we'll see some heroes where this definitely works. I think the Gilgamesh and Aeneas, both are heroes that sort of definitely change over the course. Arguably, so does Achilles, but less so. And there's, in Achilles' case, he's pretty much stuck in a place, so there isn't that like leaving. The third part, because it has this selection from an Ephesian tale, is a bit peculiar because an Ephesian tale is a Greek romance that's really focused on the couple that initially do not like one another, but of course do fall in love, and then they get separated and they spend the rest of the work trying to get back together, and they successfully do, and they're happily married. They get married and they live happily ever after. The fact that it starts in Ephesus, and I haven't read it, but probably ends in Ephesus, doesn't take away from the fact that it doesn't really give us much information about Artemis. But Artemis in the east, Ephesus is in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. It's right on the coast. There was a great temple of Artemis there, one of the 7 wonders of the world in the ancient world. It was a big cult. But the Artemis in the East is a stranger sort of figure than the Artemis in the West. The Artemis in the West is generally portrayed as a girl in either a short dress or a long dress that's been tied up over her knees so that she can, run in the woods. She's generally barefoot. She's got a bow and arrow. She might have a circlet around her head that has like a little moon crescent on it. But she's basically a huntress figure. The figure in the East is stranger and is connected with the goddess Cybele, who is a much stranger goddess, and we'll see her in chapter 9. So when I do the preview, which will be a separate video of chapter 9, we'll talk a little bit about Cybele and the worship of Cybele. Artemis doesn't quite get as strange as that, but if you look at the cult statue of Artemis of Ephesus in the book, it's a copy, of course, because the original doesn't survive. That's a strange-looking statue, right? That does not seem like the Artemis that we think of as the sort of like sylvan nymph running around. So, the modern takes on Apollo and Artemis are interesting. So we've got the poem Daphne by Alicia Stallings. And here, of course, Daphne, though she is caught by Apollo, she will remain ever distant. So this is sort of it's somewhat similar to the Narcissus flower. It doesn't actually describe an attack, which the Narcissus flower by Rita Dove does, but it does have something in that same feel that Apollo may have caught her, but she now has bark and things like that to sort of protect her. Right, so she's got armor on, so she's sort of like a wounded figure who's protecting herself. The 2 selections from about the Actaeon story, which we talked about a little bit in the last class, are by Seamus Heaney and Don Patterson. So Seamus Heaney's poem is just called Actaeon, and it basically takes that scene after Actaeon has been transformed into a deer and wonders what that felt like. Ovid does the same sort of thing. Ovid tells how he's transformed, and initially he's sort of amazed because he can run really fast. He sees his reflection in the water and sees he's now a deer, and he's sort of horrified, but he can't scream because deers don't scream, right? So he can't. He's human in his brain, but he's animal in his body, and he, it's going to turn out badly. But that's the thing that Haney sort of focuses on. The Patterson thing takes a modern look on the sort of sexual awakening of a boy. So a young boy happens to enter a room where a woman's changing or something, so he sees the woman naked, and that burns itself into his brain and becomes sort of a formative experience for him. Both Haney and Patterson seem to read the Actaeon story in terms of Actaeon and his gaze. Now that's certainly the way Artemis takes it in the story, right? She sees Actaeon, who has looked at her, right? I mean, their eyes meet, so she sees him seeing her, and she's naked. But the way Ovid presents that, it's an accident. It's not like he stayed there just ogling her. Artemis got so angry right away that he couldn't explain himself or do something, and so he gets transformed. Here, there's that moment that they refer to where a young person sort of realizes, I guess, sexual difference and possibly gets aroused, but is different at any rate. So those are some thoughts on the stuff in Chapter 8. I'm also going to do another video. I'll post them both on Chapter 9 so that you can look at both Chapter 8 and Chapter 9 because, of the circumstances that we didn't have class this week.